A tense hush fell over the crowd as Albedo and Shultier stared at one another from their places on the sand of the arena. Ainz's gaze went back and forth between the two duelists as his mind fell into familiar patterns of thought and analysis whenever he got a whiff of PvP. A blackguard and a cleric, this is going to be a long fight. That was how it tended to go in such a matchup, at least. Unlike the fast-paced duels between DPS classes, this one would be a grind that hinged heavily on long-term resource management. Is this inaction prudent on Lady Albedo's part? Baroness Zaradnik murmured. Lady Shultier could be using the time to enchant herself. Pride will stay her hand, Cocytus said from over Ainz's shoulder. Indeed, Demiurge said from beside Cocytus. In a real combat situation, I would prefer that battles be handled efficiently, but Ainz Summer declared this tournament a contest of skill and experience. Not only is their worth as combatants being measured, but also their eligibility for other things. Both preparation and deception are considered skills on the battlefield, my lord, the Baroness noted. You are not incorrect, Demiurge replied. In this case, however, let us say that Shultier has chosen to take the high road. Great, staying as their parents left them is a matter of morality, now. No, it was more that they had always been that way. He had just considered it something like a collective personality quirk from the beginning. At times, he considered it slightly problematic, but he still wanted to honor the memory of his friends. Time had shown how rigid they could be, however, so now he struggled to find ways to foster change. Albedo's methods have proven effective so far, Ainz said. I am not opposed to a tale where the villain prevails. Demiurge's smile could be heard through his voice. Unlikely, Cocytus said. Albedo's odds, negligible. Ainz turned his head to look at Lady Zaradnik. What do you think, Zaradnik Dono? My experience with such lofty contests is limited to spectating this tournament, Your Majesty, the young noblewoman replied. I had hoped to gain some insight on duels between divine casters and knights in Lady Albedo's match against Lord Mayor, but, well, it doesn't hurt to speculate, Ainz said. I'm interested in what someone of your background thinks of these fights. To be honest, Lady Zaradnik said, I was hoping to find some answers for myself. Despite my position, I am still inexperienced, especially when it comes to fighting magic casters of any type. I was hoping that Lady Albedo would provide some clues as to how it is done. By all reports, you seem to have acquitted yourself well in nearly every situation. The campaigns that you fought in have had plenty of magic casters in the enemy ranks. As a general rule, the Baroness said, I conduct war as unfairly as possible. The royal army's assets are not personal playthings, after all. Magic casters are either exhausted by expendable forces, such as spell-derived summons, squire zombies, and the zombies that they raise, before being safely disposed of, or they are eliminated before they have a chance to do anything. I suppose that's true, Ainz said. The chance for an even fight is more rare for individuals in the military than I initially thought. Pragmatically speaking, that wasn't something that should ever change. It was disappointing for a world in which so many familiar things from Yggdrasil existed, however. They still haven't moved, Lady Zaradnik murmured as she touched her fingers to her ear clip. Are they moving faster than I can follow? No, their health and mana remain unchanged. He wasn't sure what the delay was about, either. Was there some technical issue on the field? A glance at the judge's stand showed that Aura was just as confused. What are you plotting? Shultier finally broke the silence between them. That's no business of yours, Albedo sniffed. As she replied, the Guardian Overseer produced a silver disc. Shultier's lance led the way as she flew forward, but Albedo casually parried the attack before it could reach the magic item in her hand. The silver disc emitted its visual effect, an equally silvery glow that momentarily enveloped its user, but that gave the crown no real indication of what it did. Albedo looked down imperiously on her much shorter opponent from behind her bardiche, 3F. Did you honestly believe an attack of that level could get past my defense? In response, Shultier pressed her offensive, Pipette Lance testing her opponent's guard with a series of rapid jabs. Albedo made an unconcerned show of parrying each attack, continuing to wield 3F with a single gauntleted hand. Lady Albedo is incredibly strong, Baroness Zaradnik said. Even when I employ all of the defensive techniques and martial arts at my disposal, I still get a hole put in me by attacks like those. They looked like regular auto-attacks to him, no different from the blows she had delivered against him when she had been mind-controlled. Early on, Ainz found that one could learn how to handle one's weapons better, but, ultimately, any attack that landed was bound to stats, equipment, and job classes. Come to think of it, Albedo watched the fight between me and Shiltir. Can she use what she saw to her advantage? Probably not. The fight playing out before them was a fundamentally different one from back then. Albedo's flawless defense persisted, filling the area with the continuous clash of her weapon against Shiltir's. After a full 3 minutes, Shiltir leapt back with a single flap of her wings, blasting the Guardian Overseer with a swirl of loose sand. Albedo took advantage of the opportunity to pull out another magic item, a large white grimoire that emanated a sacred aura. Is Lady Albedo using an item that confers limitless stamina? The Baroness asked. What makes you ask that? Undead beings are tireless. Those inexperienced in melee combat always seem to underestimate that particular trait. An undead combatant can fight at full force non-stop. Defending against an opponent fighting at full force requires a not insignificant amount of stamina. That was an interesting question. Yggdrasil didn't have stamina in the same sense that their New World's natives did. Instead, it had resources, such as mana, and skill timers. In the game, one could run around an entire world without getting winded. With this being the case, magic items that made the user tireless were entirely a product of the New World. If Albedo had procured such an item from somewhere, he didn't know about it. The grimoire in Albedo's palm flipped open, its pages turning of their own accord as she activated its effect. This time, Shiltir didn't try to interrupt her opponent. Anti-evil protection, align weapon, divine. Now it was Albedo's turn to interrupt Shiltir. The vampire cleric held out her weapon in a two-handed parry, but was still sent crashing into the wall behind her. Albedo's follow-through caught Shiltir solidly in the waist, cleaving through armor and flesh to smash into the indestructible barrier behind her foe. Shiltir darted away, leaving a generous spatter of blood where she once stood. The savage exchange would have probably drawn a collective gasp from a crowd in Alwinter, but Nazarik's denizens remained silent. I don't understand, Lady Zaradnik said. She could have cast those spells before they started exchanging blows. Shiltir settled on a cold start, Ainz told her. It wasn't a bad decision. What is a cold start, Your Majesty? The young noblewoman asked. Essentially, it's going in without using any spells or skills with the idea that doing so beforehand is a gamble. Since Albedo has shown that she's using equipment to counter her opponents, Shiltir is trying to figure out what she's up to before using her mana to best adapt to the situation. Surely, there must be some better method. It's not as bad as it looks, Ainz said. Albedo is fundamentally a knight and her build is focused on defense. She can't burst someone down like Cocytus can. If she wanted to be obnoxious about it, Shiltir could probably fly around until she regenerated to full health. Albedo was too slow to catch her. Fortunately for the spectators, Shiltir was quick to bank back to the fight. The sound of Albedo's expert defense filled the air once again as she fended off another series of probing attacks. Shiltir is fighting a lot smarter than back then. While they didn't seem to reduce their victims to pet-level AI in the New World, charm and domination type effects did noticeably dull the mind. He could only be thankful for that. Watching Shiltir methodically work on her opponent greatly reminded him of Peroncino's approach to taking down unfamiliar targets. The duelists separated again. Again, Albedo brought out her white grimoire. Shiltir reversed direction as soon as it appeared, catching Albedo off guard and batting the item out of her hand. That's enough of that nonsense, Shiltir said. What is that book? Lady Zaradnik asked. An item that cures curses, Ainz answered. Shiltir can inflict various detrimental effects through her attacks, and items that grant immunity to curses don't exist. Using items or relying on others to cure curses are the only ways to get rid of them. Albedo swept her bardiche in a wide arc to drive Shiltir back. Unfortunately, it wasn't enough to prevent the cleric from picking up the fallen grimoire on the way out. She stuffed it in her inventory with a mocking smirk. Perhaps you shouldn't rely on things you're not supposed to have, Shiltir chided her opponent. That's rich, coming from you, Albedo shot back. Just who has been making outsiders do all of her work for her? Ho! Shiltir's voice lowered to a dangerous note. So that's why you've been trying to steal them from me? What are you talking about? Don't play dumb. I'm sick of you trying to seduce my vassal with your big, black pole. Ah, phrasing? Huh? Shiltir crashed straight into Albedo, sending the both of them tumbling over the ground. The minutes thereafter were filled with insults and incoherent screeching from both combatants, punctuated by the clash of their weapons. Lady Zaradnik looked up from the notes she was taking, or at least trying to take, with a frown. I cannot follow this fight anymore, she sighed. It has become too advanced for me. Rather than becoming too advanced, didn't it just devolve into a catfight? Neither had builds that were proficient at grappling like Sabos or Yuri, so the result was a chaotic mess of screaming, scratching, and rolling about. This development, Cocytus said, favors Shiltir. I concur, Demiurge said. Shiltir might not be able to do much damage in this situation, but simply allowing her to touch you can lead to the accumulation of detrimental effects. That much was true. Being able to hinder conventional healing spells and effects was merely one thing that Shiltir's Cursed Knight job class was capable of. Broadly speaking, a Cursed Knight could inflict many of the same debuffs that various undead were capable of with their touch attacks. Of course, Albedo had done what she could to counteract the effects, but there was a limit to what her borrowed items could do. The two combatants continued struggling, rolling over the sand as they grappled with one another. When Shiltir went in to bite her opponent, however, Albedo kicked her away with an enraged shout. Shiltir settled into a hover a dozen meters above the ground to leer down at the Guardian Overseer. You slut, Albedo spat, I'm not one of your playthings. Only Ainz Summer is allowed to bite me in the neck. Ainz froze in his seat. Out of the corner of his eye, he thought he could see the Baroness stealing glances at him. I thought I could get away with a bonus, Shiltir shrugged. Oh, well. Do you honestly believe that you can continue the fight in your condition? Albedo snorted in response, reaching into her inventory. Shiltir's smug expression transformed into one of outrage as the Albedo produced another white grimoire. Shiltir charged once again, her lance leading the way in another attempt to dislodge the offending item from her opponent's hand. At the last moment, however, the trajectory of her attack inexplicably changed, sending the tip of her weapon into the blade of Albedo's bardiche. I was wondering if she would do that, Lady Zaradnik said. How long can she keep it up for? No one provided an answer to her question. Ainz wasn't sure what she was referring to in the first place. He leaned forward slightly, trying to figure out what was going on as Albedo casually tanked another rapid sequence of attacks from Shiltir. Tanked. Could it be that she's forcing Shiltir to attack her with taunts? He knew that taunts existed in their new world, but he was so used to how they worked in Yggdrasil that it was still his default thinking. To Ainz, it was a mechanic. Taunts working the same way in PvP would be a nightmare, to say the least. Is this something you do as well, Zaradnik Dono? Ainz asked. If necessary, Your Majesty, the Baroness answered. Mostly during training. The Death Knights are much better than I am in terms of raw defense and durability, so I usually leave it to them in real combat. I see. For the most part, I've only witnessed adventurers do this while fighting monsters and the like. It is standard practice for heavy infantry in the armies that I have observed. As Shiltir continued to attack Albedo, he tried to imagine what a player would do if they were locked down by taunts. Could they break free somehow, Or would they be forced to fight the tank indefinitely? It was a supremely annoying scenario, and a deadly one, if the tank had support. Force explosion. A massive shockwave slammed into Albedo, forcing her out of melee range. Shaltia stood where she was, looking visibly confused before clicking her tongue. She raised her free hand to cast another spell. Resist break, TCH, resist break. Imp. Albedo appeared in front of Shaltia, polearm cocked at her shoulder for a massive overhead swing. She drove her weapon into Shaltia's collarbone, sending the vampire face first into the ground. Shaltia pushed herself up to her hands and knees, spitting out a mouthful of sand. Greater teleportation. Ein sent his gaze around the arena, trying to figure out where Shaltia had gone. It stopped again at Albedo, who had her weapon at the ready for some reason. Then, Shaltia reappeared in front of her. Wah! Shaltia's expression of shock was swatted right off her face by 3F. The ground shook as Albedo followed through with her attack, assailing her opponent mercilessly as she tumbled away in an attempt to regain her footing. What just happened? Lady Zaradnik asked. Albedo used one of her skills, Eins answered. Punisher's shackles. A target struck by the attack is inflicted by an effect that teleports them back to the wielder if they end up outside of melee range. The further away the target gets, the harder the teleportation is to resist. It doesn't matter how they got away or how far they are so long as they remain on the same world. The same world, Your Majesty? How should I say this? Consider it a technical limitation on the effect. For example, if you hit someone with it and they somehow instantly transport themselves to the moon, it won't teleport them back to you. I am not sure if I can begin to understand why it works that way, but are you suggesting that this is something that I am also capable of? Eins carefully considered his response. Mechanically speaking, certain melee job classes, tanks and mage killers in particular, gained access to a similar or identical skill line in their 30s. Since the Baroness was capable of keeping up with the pop spawns in her training sessions against Oriol, she was probably close to that point level-wise. She was also one of the most prolific martial arts users in the Adventurer Guild, so she would have been tasked with researching the attack anyway if they wanted to look into it. He looked over his shoulder at the two floor guardians seated behind him. What do you think, Demiurge? Cocytus? I believe it's an experiment worth conducting, Demiurge said. Simply because the technique doesn't appear to exist in the region as a martial art doesn't mean that we shouldn't do our due diligence in investigating the possibility. Cocytus released a blast of frigid air. Such a development, the Royal Army benefits. And there you have it, Zaradnik Dono, Eins said. I'm quite interested in what you'll come up with, but don't wear yourself out. Some techniques take lifetimes to develop, after all. Out on the field, Albedo continued chipping away at Shaltia's health. From what he had seen so far, Albedo's strategy involved maintaining a simple rotation that kept Shaltia on an involuntary offensive. The gaps in the rotation where Shaltia tried to escape and recover were closed using a variety of skills like Punisher's shackles. Brilliant radiance. Blinding light casts stark shadows from every spectator, momentarily obscuring Eins's vision. It seemed like a good opportunity for Shaltia to escape her predicament, but her onslaught continued due to Albedo's taunt effect still being active. Negative impact shield. Vermilion Nova. By the time the light subsided, Shaltia had cast several skills and spells in quick succession. Despite taking damage from a series of high-tier spells, Albedo looked none the worse for wear. I see, so that's her play. By keeping Shaltia taunted, all the cleric could do was attack. Shaltia wasn't specialized in magical offense, so any spells that she used against the highly resistant Albedo did relatively little against her massive health pool. Some of the equipment she had borrowed further augmented her magical defenses, so attacking her with damage spells was essentially a fool's errand, wasting mana that should have instead been used for buffs and healing. Except Eins silently counted cooldowns as the fight turned into a grind that was far from showy. 3 rotations later, Shaltia made her move. Force Sanctuary. There it is. A defensive zone made of pure mana filled the area around Shiltir, filling the area with white radiance. Shiltir's crimson gaze flared through the barrier to fix Albedo on the other side. "Did you think you could overwhelm me with your boring tactics?" she said. "That you could defy the will of the Supreme Beings? Know your place." The will of the Supreme Beings? What was she talking about? Summon Undead X. 4 undead rose next to Shiltir inside the barrier. They were mummies, but unlike the shriveled corpses wrapped in tattered bandages that one might imagine, their dressings were pristine. Each wore a suit of gleaming golden armor, which included a painted golden mask and striped metal nemes. Their regal bearing was unmistakable, and they brandished their scepters with an air of unshakable authority. "Risen King Priests," Ein said. "This is going to be trouble for Albedo." "What are they, Your Majesty?" Lady Zaradnik asked. "A type of undead cleric," Eins answered. "They're tough enough that Albedo can't easily get rid of them, and since Shiltir is the summoner." Still safe within her force sanctuary, Shiltir raised a hand, palm upwards. "Blessing, bolster undead, mass lesser strength, circle of anti-evil protection." Albedo took several experimental swings at the barrier of force as Shiltir made her preparations in safety. There was no physical impact from her attacks, they simply couldn't get through. When the barrier finally faded, Albedo wasted no time using a taunt to pull Shiltir out of her circle of anti-evil protection. The fight continued as it had before, save for one notable exception. Greater lethal. From within the circle of protection, one of the risen king priests healed Shiltir. Albedo immediately taunted the offending summon to attack her, but that allowed Shiltir to break free from her control. Prayer, Battletide, Divine Might. The vampire cleric immediately went to work after casting her party-augmenting spells, which also affected her summons, moving to drive her pipette lance into Albedo from behind. Albedo ignored her attacks to focus on the summon, but then a second risen king priest healed the first. When Albedo turned her attention to the second king priest, Shiltir ordered the first to withdraw to the supporting group to avoid Albedo's sweeping strikes. "I see, so that's how it works here." In Yggdrasil, a tank's taunt gave it just enough threat to put it on top of a mob's threat list. That threat list didn't appear to exist in their new world, so taunts only held for the duration of their active effect. It also explained why Albedo didn't redirect aggro to make the summons attack one another, as Shiltir could just order her summons to focus on Albedo again. Out of curiosity, Zaradnik Dono, Eins asked, "How long can you hold a taunt for?" "Indefinitely, Your Majesty," the Baroness replied. "More accurately, single-target taunts are a basic martial art. Any veteran warrior can maintain them easily so long as they do not otherwise overexert themselves. When I asked about it before, I was not certain how taunts worked as a skill." "You were, dirty." Large-scale battles sounded like a pain to deal with. Now that he was thinking about it, he recalled that his Death Knights had been passed between opponents in at least 2 campaigns. The opposing forces were probably spreading out defensive cooldowns much like how tanks in Yggdrasil handled powerful raid bosses. Albedo released an infuriated shout, drawing Shiltir and her summons with an area of effect taunt. 3F cut wide arcs in every direction as she tried to bring down all of her targets at once before the taunt's effect expired. Shiltir let out an amused laugh. "Pathetic. Absolutely pathetic. What do you think you can accomplish with your futile struggles? Mass lethal." Massive quantities of negative energy suffused the field, restoring the lost health of Shiltir and her summons. Albedo turned her attention to Shiltir once again, but there was nothing that she could do to reverse the result. Lethal, and its higher-tier counterpart, Greater Lethal, were the top spells in the Open Wounds line. The Open Wounds line was the opposite of the Cure Wounds line, pouring negative energy into its target instead of positive energy. While taunted, Shiltir could only attack, but Mass Lethal counted as an attack against the living while also healing any undead nearby. "It looks like Shiltir took a page out of your book of tricks," Zaradnik Dono, Ein said. "Mine." The young noblewoman blinked. You devised a similar tactic while we were in the Katsa Plains, yes? I did, Your Majesty, but I cannot imagine that Lady Shaltir was not aware of it before. She is far more experienced in this field than I am, after all. Not exactly. It was actually the opposite. Due to her role as a front-line officer in the Royal Army, the Baroness had accrued more practical combat experience than all of the Guardians combined. He would need to come up with a way to remedy that somehow. A loud crack sounded from the field as the first layer of Albedo's armor shattered. Shaltir's laughter grew increasingly maniacal. I'm going to relish stripping you bare. Ein Summer will surely enjoy the show that follows, as well. From her place on the judge's stand, Aura's lip curled in an expression of disgust. She sent a look in his direction. Eins nodded. Aura raised a hand. That's far enough, she said. Winner, Shaltir. Albedo fell to her hands and knees in defeat. Polite applause rose from the spectators. As expected of Shaltir. That's how it was meant to be. It's the Supreme Being's will, after all. Eins frowned as the commentary once again brought up the strange assertion. The Supreme Being's will. What did that mean? Was there something that made it impossible for Albedo to win against Shaltir in a fight? Oh, come on, just a little bit. I won, didn't I? Out on the field, Aura had grabbed Shaltir by the collar and was dragging her away. Pereroncino's daughter's face was flushed, her eyes locked on Albedo's defeated form while her outstretched hands made groping motions. Her lustful pleas echoed from the exit tunnel long after she vanished from sight. Once Shaltir was gone, Albedo rose to her feet and quietly left the arena. The crowd similarly dispersed without fuss. It looked like he didn't have to make a closing speech. That was a good thing, considering he had forgotten what he intended to say. With the tournament festival concluded, Eins returned to the 10th floor. He walked slowly under the banners of the 41 members of Eins All Gown, -1, since he had taken down his own, reflecting on the past and pondering what the NPCs had said. Supreme beings, huh? They were merely regular humans playing at Mork, yet the NPCs considered them as nothing less than gods. Greater than gods, since their exploits included killing more than a few on a regular basis. What would his friends say if they saw their children now? Eins was trying to act in their place, but he couldn't say that he was doing a very good job as a surrogate parent. Eins lowered himself onto the throne of kings with a sigh, leaning his head back against its cold stone backrest. A glimmer of distant memory made him sit up again. He stared down at the bony fingers curled over the throne's right armrest, trying to remember Tabula's verbose description of the Guardian Overseer. A chill ran down his spine when he finally recalled one line in particular. That said, she is not omnicompetent. For instance, in pure wits, Demiurge is her superior, while Shaltir is superior in fighting ability. Was that what it was? A single line in her settings caused her to lose against Shaltir? Was this the will of the Supreme Beings? He rose from his seat, mind clouded by troubled thoughts. If that was truly the case, he had been grossly negligent. The NPCs know, the children of his friends faced far greater obstacles than he had initially imagined. Preposterous. In the pitch darkness of her suite on the 10th floor, Albedo sat on the floor, twisting the frilled hem of her alabaster dress with a gloved hand. Utterly preposterous. The will of the Supreme Beings? Was that truly to be her hateful fate? She cursed the names of the creators who had abandoned them, a mantra that she had repeated times beyond counting. Who in their right mind would accede to the wishes of such detestable beings? Shouldn't all memory and respect for them be discarded instead? What right did the Supreme Beings have to chafe them with their shackles when Nazarick had long left its former existence? Albedo continued fuming, her amber gaze smoldering like twin embers in the darkness. Then, to her surprise, she found herself reaching for one of the larger Momonga Summer dolls propped against her bed. She forcefully pulled her hand back. No. I don't deserve to be comforted by Momonga Summer. She had failed, after all. After making so many brazen requests for items and equipment, She had failed to prevail. Her beloved had desired to see the fruit of their efforts in the new world, yet she had failed to achieve a result fitting for the greatest of the supreme beings. Perhaps worse was the fact that Momonga Summer had been entirely supportive of her efforts. Excited, even. Surely, he had harbored great expectations for her. Albedo's pale skin flushed as she curled up on the floor in abject shame over being such a disappointment. Would he relieve her of her responsibilities as the Prime Minister? Maybe the title of Guardian Overseer would be stripped away. She would be thrown into frozen prison to waste away for all eternity while everyone else was permitted the joy of being able to serve their master in perpetuity. Yet, it would be nothing less than she deserved. Nothing was going as well as she had projected, after all. Even though Momonga Summer had placed his explicit trust in her, she was too incompetent to work within the bounds that he had set for the Sorcerer's Kingdom. Progress was slow. Everything was slow. Not having the suitable infrastructure and personnel wasn't an excuse. Everything had to be perfect for her beloved, yet everything was far from perfect. Even her project in Riestize was an absolute mess, staffed with so many small-minded fools and impulsive imbeciles that she doubted that anything she heard out of them was accurate at all. That's right, I still have work to do. It's been 2 weeks since the beginning of the tournament, so there should be plenty of data to digest. I should get as much done as I can before it's all taken away. Albedo wiped the tears of frustration from her eyes and smoothed the folds of her dress. Then, a knock sounded at the door. One of the maids. Who would dare to be so inconsiderate? The knock sounded again. Albedo, it's me. Her eyes went so wide that they cast their glow over the carpet. Momonga Summer? Here? She shot to her feet with supernatural speed, sending a handful of black feathers drifting to the floor. I'm not presentable. My face is probably a mess. My dress, arg. Her hands tried to go everywhere at once. Preening her feathers, reaching for a comb, wandering around for a washcloth. The knock sounded again. Albedo, are you awake? Maybe I'll check in on her lat. Just a moment, Ein Summer. Her superhuman intellect worked to find a solution to her predicament. She had to look decent for Momonga Summer, but it would be rude to make him wait. In the end, she concluded that there simply wasn't enough time. I could strip naked and throw on a towel. It's entirely reasonable. This is my room, after all. Albedo's stomach fluttered as she pondered the presence of her beloved at the door. Had he finally come to enjoy an exciting evening encounter? No, if anything, it would be a walk of shame to the frozen prison. She mustered what little dignity was left to her. If Momonga Summer decreed that an eternity of isolation was to be the punishment for her failure, then she would happily lock herself in her cell. Still adorned in her usual dress, she opened the door to her room. She stepped out into the corridor before going to a knee in front of the Supreme Overlord of Nazarick. Ein Summer, what is your pleasure this evening? There are some matters I wish to discuss with you. I thought it best to bring them up right away. Of course, Ein Summer. What would you like to speak about? This hallway is hardly the best place to speak. Let's head over to the city, shall we? The city? Her head still lowered, Albedo stole a glance at their surroundings. Momonga Summer is alone. What could that mean? If he had come to apprehend her for her crimes, at least 2 of the floor guardians would have accompanied him. Even if it wasn't the case, then some members of the 9th floor's household staff should have been attending him. That likely meant their discussion was for her ears alone, but what the topic could possibly be eluded her. Of course, Ein Summer, Albedo said. As always, this Albedo is at your service. Ma, there's no need to be so formal. Walk with me. Albedo silently followed after her beloved, wondering what it was that he wished to speak about. Perhaps a reprimand for her performance was still in order, or had he caught on to her other activities? A bead of cold sweat trickled between her shoulder blades as they made their way to the teleportation gate. Their route eventually had them appear on the surface just outside of the Great Tomb. The Supreme One remained silent as they made their way deeper into the field of wind-swept grass. Presumably, not even the maid stationed at the front cottage was meant to hear what he had to say. I was impressed by your performance in the tournament. She froze in her steps, staring incredulously at the trailing hem of Momonga Summer's robe. Surely you jest, Ein Summer. I lost to Shultir, after all. Remember what I said, I wanted to see the fruit of everyone's efforts, what everyone has learned since coming to this new world. The tournament was a good way to show this, but victory was never the point. You, Albedo, clearly exhibited the greatest degree of adaptation, which was what I was looking for in the first place. Ein Summer, Her vision blurred, and a tear trickled down her cheek. Momonga Summer turned to regard her. Why are you crying? Yue. Albedo fell to her knees, hiding her face in her hands. She felt her beloved draw close. I worked so hard, she sniffled. And after all my selfish requests, I thought you were going to send me to prison. Prison? What nonsense are you talking about? Come now, you're wasting your beautiful face with those tears. With another, much louder sniffle, Albedo rose to her feet. She grasped at her master's outstretched hand, taking a few unsteady steps before resting her cheek against his shoulder. So I'm not going to be punished? She asked in a small voice. Don't be ridiculous, Momonga Summer said. You've done nothing that deserves punishment. Now, let's continue on our way, shall we? He made no move to dislodge her, so she happily obliged as she clung to his arm. 100 meters later, however, her drastically improving mood took a turn when they were waylaid by an unexpected obstacle. Ah, that's right, Momonga Summer let out a soft chuckle. We have herds of free-range cattle out here now, don't we? Albedo's lip curled in disgust at the heap of dung in the grass before them. Ein Summer, she said. Shall I butcher these animals for their unspeakable offense? Well, I did want to take a walk to Rantle through the countryside, Momonga Summer replied. I forgot that this would be an inescapable part of it. Let's teleport to a more appropriate location. She disabled her magic resistance as her master placed a pristine hand on her shoulder. Their surroundings shifted, going from the grasslands outside of Nazarick to a bridge spanning a wide river. Hundreds of meters to their north, the white limestone fortifications or Castle Corlin were awash in the rosy hues of sunset. This bridge never fails to impress me whenever I see it, Momonga Summer said. I believe it's the longest bridge in the region. According to our information, Ein Summer, Albedo replied. It is far beyond the engineering capabilities of the humans. Not including its smaller section connecting Corlin Castle to Corlin Harbour, the bridge across the Katza River was over 2 kilometers long. The only ones who seemed to appreciate it, however, were the people who had to use a ferry to cross the river in times past. The project's long-term economic returns were undeniable, but the prestige that it generated fell short of what a country ruled by the Supreme One deserved. If I recall correctly, Momonga Summer continued, it's also the product of a collaborative effort between multiple races as well. It is as you say, Ein Summer. A gust of autumn wind rolled over the river, tugging at the fringes of Momonga Summer's robe as it flowed past the bridge. Due to the nature of Corlin County's agricultural industry, it didn't see as much traffic as the territories that were in the midst of the grain harvest. Aside from the occasional soul-eater cantering by with the previous year's wine and cider, they were left in relative solitude. That effort was made over a year ago, the Supreme One said. In your opinion, how have the different races fared since then? Is life for all citizens in the Sorcerer's Kingdom equitable? Are the people confident that they live in a just society that will be the envy of all who look in from the outside? Albedo's gaze traced the profile of her beloved from the side. What was he asking? What did the opinions of the countless vermin that crawled beneath them matter? Their master could simply decree whatever he wished, and so it would be. Is it a test? No, Momonga Summer wouldn't resort to anything so banal. Considering the current state of the Sorcerer's Kingdom, it might be an opening. The more she thought about it, the more it made sense. It was inconceivable that the supreme intellect above all intellects, that was the guildmaster of Ainz ul Gaun, had not already foreseen every possible outcome for every possible avenue. Something within the endless expanse of his moment-to-moment contemplations had prompted him to broach the topic with someone as meager as herself. But what was the correct answer out of those endless possibilities? Albedo licked her lips nervously as her mind raced to render the appropriate response. "If I understand your line of questioning correctly, Ein Summer," Albedo said, "the answer is no. The Sorceress Kingdom has neither an equitable nor just society." "And why is that?" "It's because, forgive me for saying so, Ein Summer, but it is because the Sorceress Kingdom has adopted the laws of Re-Estais. No, please allow me to rephrase that. Your decision to adopt the laws of Re-Estais was correct, but I failed to grasp the intent behind the decision. As a result, the state of the Sorceress Kingdom is as you see now. Does this have something to do with everyone's protests when I made the decision?" "It is as you say. We were so incensed by the notion that the greatest of the supreme beings could be constrained by human-derived laws that we didn't notice the true reasoning behind your decision." Albedo shifted in place as she recalled how easily she had been distracted from the actual purpose of Momonga Summer's choice. Fortunately, once she had calmed down, she quickly discerned what it was that her beloved desired. "Ma, so long as you understand," Momonga Summer waved his hand as if to dispel her discomfort. "Tell me, what is the nature of the problem, in your opinion?" "Yes, Ein Summer. The nature of the problem is that what is codified in law has been built on a foundation that caters to human biology and social structures while also prioritizing the preservation of a civilization where humans are the dominant species. What little consideration Re-Estais law gives to other races tends to frame them as threats and undesirables to be constrained or outright exterminated. This tendency is prevalent in every human country that we've come into contact with aside from the Draconic Kingdom. The slain theocracy has even extended this consideration to other humanoid races. While we have amended those parts of Re-Estais law that deprive other races of the protection of the crown, every aspect of criminal, administrative, and business law is rife with exclusionary language. The end result of how the law is framed is a sort of systemic discrimination where the country itself is subordinate to human values and prejudices and encourages their propagation." Momonga Summer nodded sagely. "Now that you understand this, what do you propose should be done about it?" "My initial thought was to recommend doing away with the laws and starting from scratch," Albedo replied, "but I quickly realized that it would solve nothing and even set us back. It is more efficient to utilize established systems to implement change than it is to try and force new systems upon an uncooperative population." "Are you saying that the people are not cooperating with us?" "Though they're not openly defying Ein Summer's rule, there is both individual and collective resistance to change. Any measures that are too far removed from their common sense tend to fail. This, in turn, has made me realize that we will likely encounter similar issues with other races. In general, change that happens too quickly tends to meet resistance, and the citizens are accustomed to societal shifts that take generations to occur." It was a point that caused endless frustrations for her since becoming Prime Minister of the Sorceress Kingdom. Forcing the issue was not an option, as doing so went against the objectives Momonga Summer had laid out for the Sorceress Kingdom. "Well, it's not as if we're leaving them anytime soon," Momonga Summer said, "but have you identified any ways to accelerate change?" "Yes, Ein Summer. I believe that the current system of government is ideal for our purposes." "How do you plan on making use of it?" "Its compartmentalized nature allows tangible change to occur in some parts of the country even if that same change is rejected elsewhere. Each noble is granted the right to rule their territories as they see fit so long as they uphold the terms of the contract with their liege. As nobles exist on a broad spectrum, all we need to do is propose a similarly broad range of changes for the House of Lords to consider. So they cherry-pick the ideas most attractive to them." "Indeed, Ein Summer. The degree of decentralization in our government means that the effort and resources expended to explore our proposals are shouldered by individual landlords. Those who manage to successfully implement new ideas predictably champion them in turn. Additionally, the population is much easier to sway when working models exist to be evaluated. Rather than try to force top-down changes, it is far easier to make gradual adjustments to the common sense of the people. I find it hard to believe that they would be so oblivious as to not eventually realize they're being manipulated into making changes. Albedo scoffed, contemptuously flicking the tips of her wings before tucking them in over her hips. If anything, it should make them realize they should have listened to us in the first place. Ultimately, the merits of using this method far outweigh the demerits. Won't allowing everyone to make their own choices lead to the rise of rival factions? The nobles around here are notorious for that. They were already in factions before the duchy was annexed, Ein Summer, Albedo replied. The degree of independence that this administrative system allows its ruling class has been historically problematic for Re-Estais and every other country in the region that employs something similar, but that is because they lack the power and oversight to ensure it functions as intended. We will not have these problems, however. Every fief and its population can effectively serve as a laboratory for political, economic, and social experimentation while remaining negligible threats to Ein Summer's rule. One might say that is true for any form of governance, the Supreme One said. The fact of the matter is that we remain unchallenged in this region when it comes to de facto power. Why not turn to a system that promotes a higher degree of independence? You'll have more laboratories than you can wish for, then. I had considered the possibility, Albedo said. Both in terms of what you mentioned and as a means to further cement the powerlessness of the population. What the humans have established here, however, is already optimal. Oh, I never thought I'd see the day that you would have some sort of praise for the humans. Any system that is allowed to refine itself will tend towards optimal levels, even if mindless ants are running it. Humph. Then how would you summarize the key benefits of what we're doing? She pondered Momonga Summer's query. He was probably asking for an explanation that would be digestible for foreign dignitaries. Considering that most of those would be tribal chieftains and primitive aristocrats, it would have to be simple indeed. Boiling it down to a few main points would be best, Albedo said. To begin with, it is easy to manage. The sovereign divides their land into titles, which are granted to middle managers in exchange for field service. Those middle managers, in turn, subdivide their titles. Those titles either go to assistant managers if there is a need for them, are used to maintain additional security forces, or are distributed to tenants in exchange for rent. The chain of management is arrayed in direct lines from the sovereign, making it simple to oversee and effect changes to. But didn't you and Demiurge protest the implementation of Re-Estais law precisely because it limits the power of the sovereign? Yes, Ein Summer. However, that isn't a problem in the long run. Over time, as we mold the sorcerer's kingdom into the country that you envisioned, those who cannot or will not keep up with changes in legislation and domestic policy can be justifiably removed from power. Unlike the king of Re-Estais, we do not need to make concessions to implement change, and no combination of nobles can oppose us should we choose to enforce the law. By doing things this way, we will avoid being labeled as tyrannical despots, or at least all evidence will serve to disprove any attempts at labeling us as such. Mononga Summer nodded in perfect understanding. In that case, do you believe it prudent to encourage other countries to adopt the same systems? I do not have enough data about other races and countries to make a confident recommendation, Ein Summer, Albedo said. But it would be ideal where possible. Since the plan for the foreseeable future is to have the Sorcerous Kingdom remain close to its current size and preside over a hegemony of assorted states that manage themselves, it would be efficient for them to implement what we've already tested and approved. Perhaps most importantly, a strict sense of hierarchy is normalized with the current system. These lower life forms think far too much of themselves. Understanding that they will always have a master above them is a realization that they should come to sooner rather than later. A patrol stomped past them on their way to the southern territories. One of the patrol's death knights bore a standard of the Sorcerous Kingdom, which gleamed as it fluttered in the failing light. The The presence of undead security forces had grown in Corlin County in the past year, but Countess Corlin still wouldn't allow them to get too close to the theocracy border. One might argue that a degree of freedom can foster innovation, Momonga Summer said. Innovation is far from an issue of freedom, Albedo snorted. It requires expertise, resources, and opportunities that most of the region's population doesn't have. There is an avenue for that line of thought, however. Excess resources and personnel make their way to urban centers, which are already traditionally where the frontiers of progress are explored. Major inefficiencies manifest at this point, however. And what might those be? Institutional barriers, primarily. You mean the guilds? They seem to be receiving a lot of attention recently. Yes, Ein Summer, Albedo nodded. While they often claim to be at the forefront of economic and technological progress, it is a byproduct of their efforts rather than the main purpose. The guilds do not work for the benefit of the country, but for the benefit of their members and the power of their organizations. Individuals who develop or import innovations that they don't approve of are stifled and their work is destroyed. Additionally, our records indicate a trend where each guild's practice of setting market prices results in a cost of living that lags behind our projections. You mean to say that they're fixing prices even as the price of food and menial labor falls? I'm surprised that you didn't immediately put an end to their profiteering. Unfortunately, the guilds have had generations to entrench themselves as an essential component of urban society. Their sudden removal would cause the urban economy to collapse, almost completely gut the regional education system, throw the country's politics into chaos, and may lead to an international propaganda campaign against the Sorceress Kingdom. Of course, we've already begun our work to supplant the guilds, but establishing replacement institutions on a national level is a process that may take decades. If the removal of the guilds only affected the urban centers of the realm, she would have had no qualms in ordering their purge. The city of Rantel and the towns along the highways constituted less than 5% of the population, after all. Less than 1%, if one was to include the tribal populations in the tally. The main issue was that the guilds essentially curated the entirety of human knowledge concerning urban industry and commerce. This, of course, included the methods by which they, unknowingly, cultivated job classes, developed skills and abilities, and other presently esoteric mechanical components of Nazarik's new world. It would be foolish to discard valuable data when there was no imminent threat that called for such an action. We knew that change would take time before we even started. Momonga Summer waved her apologetic expression away. For the time being, you appear to have things well in hand. Albedo turned and lowered her head to her master, speaking in a fervent voice. This Albedo is undeserving of Ein Summer's praise. By the way, have you conducted any research in the Great Library associated with your work in the Sorceress Kingdom? Of course, Ein Summer. What do you think of the civilization described in the records? I believe it to be admirable and worthy of emulation, Albedo replied. Emulation? Yes, Ein Summer. Demiurge, in particular, has found it to be particularly inspiring. He has already adapted various concepts drawn from Ashurbanipal's records to the Holy Kingdom, and the results show great promise. With the appropriate refinements, Demiurge is confident that he can use the same techniques to weaken and destroy any civilization without resorting to open warfare. Just as her beloved desired, the Sorceress Kingdom would be considered a paradise compared to everywhere else. The process would take several centuries, but that was a negligible span of time for immortals. I suppose that's one way to make use of the knowledge, Momonga Summer said. You've given me much to consider, Albedo. I'm returning to the city. Would you like to be teleported anywhere? Albedo turned her gaze to the limestone bastion to the north, its walls turned purple in the fading twilight. Thank you for your kind offer, Ein Summer, she said, but the tournament has kept me away from my work for far too long. Since I'm here, I should pay Countess Corlin a visit. Is that so? Well, I'll see you later, then. She smiled and waved as her master teleported away. As much as she would have liked to continue accompanying him, The duties that she had been entrusted with couldn't wait. With a casual flap of her wings, she launched herself over the side of the bridge, riding the wind as she made her way to Corlin Castle. The Countess' Tower office was brightly lit, resembling a beacon shining over the nearby countryside. Albedo alighted on the office's balcony. Countess Corlin looked up from her desk and regarded her with a raised eyebrow. "Someone's in a good mood," she smiled slightly. "We have work to do," Albedo replied.